Welcome, everybody, to the NFL show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for the NFL show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing great, Mike. How about you?
I am great. Today, we're going to talk a little historical NFL, which we're going to look at the top 10 tight ends in NFL history. Sam's younger, so he includes guys that played today. I don't, so you won't hear Rob Gronkowski on my list, but if he was, he would probably be in my top 2. But, Sam, you want to go ahead and start off with number 10 for us?
Yeah, I'll start off with number 10. For me, it was a really close call. I had two guys back there who I was really – I guess two or three guys who were really close in my opinion. I'm going with Jackie Smith, though. He was a tight end for the Cardinals back in the day, I believe, from 1963, played until 1978. 1,000-yard season, 7,918 total receiving yards. He comes in my number 10, but I do want to mention I had Charlie Sanders was very close. I almost put him in there. I did have Jason Witten back there, but I didn't think Witten should crack the top 10.
All right. Jackie Smith, of course, I think what he's most known for is not being a Cardinal, but it's dropping the touchdown pass for the Cowboys in 1978 in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, which I don't.
You don't remember, I know, because you're too young, but
I don't mind. I don't mind it either, though.
Yeah. But, yeah, anytime the Cowboys lose, I don't mind it, even though they lost to the Steelers, who I don't like either. But my number 10 is Charlie Sanders. I mean, Charlie Sanders is a guy who was inducted into the Hall of Fame about 30 years later to what he should have been in 2007. He was three-time first-team All-Pro. He was a 7-time Pro Bowler, 336 catches for 4,817 yards. That's 14.3 yards per reception, 31 TDs. He's one of the first big-time pass-catching tight ends, him, John Mack, guys like that, Mike Ditka. He was also a very good blocker and one of the greatest players in Detroit Lions history, for whatever that's worth. But he's my number 10. I've got a guy at number 9 that you just mentioned a little bit, I think, Jerry Smith, who played for the Redskins. Only a 2-time Pro Bowler, first-team All-Pro once, 421 catches, 5,496 yards, 13.1 yards per reception. He was a big-time playmaker at the tight end position. He was a big factor in the success of Coach George Allen's Over the Hill gang, which you remember the Redskins for about 20 years there didn't sniff the playoffs. And then you got Vince Lombardi, who came in, I believe it was 1969 or 70. They go 9-5. And then George Allen comes in after Lombardi passes away from cancer, takes them to the playoffs where they lose, I believe it was to the 49ers in the divisional playoff in 71. And then, of course, in 72, they beat the Cowboys 26-3 in the NFC Championship game and then went on to lose to the undefeated Dolphins 14-7. But Jerry Smith was a guy who played, I believe it was 13 years through 1977. The Redskins made the playoffs a couple more times after that. But I think Jerry Smith's a guy that gets overlooked a lot, Sam.
Yeah, let me ask you, do you think he belongs in the Hall of Fame based on his career?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at him, Charlie Sanders is there. You look at their careers, Sanders, I mean, didn't have near the stats. I mean, I know that Smith played an extra year or two over him, but when you look at it, Smith, 421 receptions to 336. I would call that about a push just because of the extra couple years. But the thing that stands out, 5,500 yards and 60 touchdowns. Charlie Sanders, 31 touchdowns. Now, a lot of that is the fact that Jerry Smith had guys like Billy Kilmer and Sonny Jurgensen throwing him the ball. Charlie Sanders played for Detroit. So when you look at that, I think maybe Greg Landry was his quarterback at the end of his career. But I couldn't even tell you who the quarterback was most years for the Lions. And the only really significant year the Lions had when Sanders was there for 10 years was the 1970 team that had one of the great defenses in NFL history that gets overlooked, where they went to the divisional playoffs, lost in Dallas 5-0. But that was a team where if you win that playoff game, that was a team that was talented enough to go to the Super Bowl, but they lacked a quarterback, which I think was a lot of Sanders' issues with the numbers. But I think there's no doubt when you look at Jerry Smith's numbers, not compared to today's tight ends, but compared to tight ends that played in the era he played, I think he definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I was surprised initially when I looked him up and found out that he wasn't in the Hall of Fame because I did expect him to be based on what he had you look at the totals from guys who played in the mid 60s to mid 70s, it really wasn't like that's not nearly the numbers we have today. I was surprised that he only has 2 Pro Bowls to his name and isn't in the Hall of Fame. But my number 9 is actually a player who recently retired. I think he retired this offseason, actually, after not playing this past year. My number 9 is Antonio Gates. And I would have had him higher on the list, but he doesn't have a Super Bowl title to his name. I did take that into account when putting this list together. I looked at for guys who had championships. Gates doesn't have one. So for me, I'm putting him at 9.
All right. Why would you look for a tight end that has championships?
Well, it came down to it's a lot of the guys. I mean, even a lot of the older players. Like I know it's a quarterback-driven league, and quarterbacks are the ones who are more measured by their titles, not tight ends, really. But if you look at all the guys ahead of him, or most of the guys ahead of him on this list, they all have Super Bowl titles almost. A lot of them do, especially a lot of the guys near the top. So to me, I had some issues with putting Gates a little bit higher. Some of the guys he bumped up and get right against with, I'll talk about in a minute. But my number 8 was Shannon Sharp. And statistically, him and Gates are a little bit closer together than most of the guys on this list. Both over 10,000 receiving yards. And Sharp had Super Bowls, Gates didn't, so I picked Sharp over Gates.
All right, I'm going to go number 8, Jackie Smith. Like I said, this is a guy that unfortunately is remembered more for Super Bowl 13 and drop pass. But I think he catches too much crap for that because that was a game where the Steelers were actually winning the game 35-17 in the fourth quarter. I think his drop was maybe at 28-17 or 21-7 or 28-17 or 21-17. I don't really remember exactly. But when you look at Smith, 5-time Pro Bowler, Hall of Fame 1994. And how about this, Sam? I believe that pass drop when he was a Dallas Cowboy, that 1 year with the Dallas Cowboys is probably why he got in the Hall of Fame so much quicker than some guys that didn't, like a Charlie Sanders. Because as a St. Louis Cardinal, you look at the Cardinals from 63 to 77, you had the Don Coryell years, 74 and 75, I think, when they made the playoffs. Other than that, there was nothing there. So even though it was a bad thing, it's kind of if they're talking about you, it's a good thing no matter what. So I think when you look at his career, that drop pass with the Dallas Cowboys probably got him the recognition in a perverse way to help get him to the Hall of Fame.
There's a huge difference between playing for the St. Louis Cardinals and playing for Dallas Cowboys. So being on a team like Dallas, sometimes just getting that name recognition out there. I guess, again, in that big moment, it's not necessarily great publicity, but there's an old saying that, like, bad press is better than no press. So for him, just getting his name out there, became a player everyone knew about in that time period. I think then maybe people were hopefully able to look back and appreciate the rest of his career.
Yeah, I mean, the guy, you look at him, he had almost 8,000 yards for his career, 40 touchdowns, but almost 17 yards per catch. Actually ran with the ball 38 times for 327 yards. So he's a big athletic guy, and he was a great player. And like I said, he spent almost all of his time in anonymity. I mean, that's what St. Louis was, especially until Don Coryell got there. And then after Don Coryell left, they went back to anonymity until they ended up in Phoenix because nobody cared about him in St. Louis, really. Where are we at? Your number 8?
I think my number 8 is Shannon Sharp.
Okay, so your number 7 or might be my number 7. My number 7, I'm going to go with Dave Casper. Dave Casper, Oakland Raiders, 1974 to 80. Went back there in 84 and finished his career. He spent some time with the Oilers and the Vikings. 4-time Pro Bowler, or 4-time first-team All-Pro, which to me is a lot bigger than being a 5-time Pro Bowler. He was a part of the Super Bowl 11 and 15 champions. If you look at him, I think when his stats, 378 catches, 5,000 yards, 52 touchdowns, and he only had, I think, like 8 or 9 catches these first 2 seasons. And he caught one of the most iconic touchdown passes in NFL history with the ghost to the post TD catch in the 1977 playoffs at Baltimore's old Memorial Stadium that led to the tying field goal. And then he had a game-winning touchdown catch over the Baltimore Colts that will be remembered forever. So the 2 Super Bowls and the ghost to the post, I mean, this is a tight end, and there's not a lot of tight ends here where you think, this guy, this play. Where, John Elway, you think of the drive. Joe Montana, you think of the drive in Super Bowl 23. This is a tight end where you could think about a catch. that was enormous, in 1977. But Sam, who do you got at number 7?
Yeah, my number 7 is Ozzie Newsome, actually. I've got Newsome at 7. I thought about having him a little higher on the list. For some reason, he only was a one-time first-team All-Pro. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me because you look back at him. This is a guy who had 2,000-yard seasons. He had a year where he had 970 receiving yards. A little bit inconsistent towards the later part of his career, but in the first, I want to say, 6 to 8 years of his career, he's one of the best tight ends in football. And a Hall of Famer inducted in 1999. I think he's one of the best tight ends of all time. I just don't think he got necessarily the recognition he probably deserved because he played for a Cleveland team that had some success, but only got past the first round of the playoffs once or twice during his time with the team.
All right. I've actually got Ozzie Newsome higher. I'll go with my number 6 right now, which is Shannon Sharp, who I think is atrocious on TV. But he's a Hall of Fame class, 2011, 4-time first-team All-Pro, 8-time Pro Bowler, 3 Super Bowl championships, 2 with that great Broncos team that went back-to-back, the 3rd with the Baltimore Ravens, 10,000 yards, 815 catches. And he has plenty to brag about, and he does. But when you look at him, I mean, this is a role that led to with the Ravens. Everybody thinks about him with the Broncos, but he had the longest TD reception in playoff history, a 96-yard score in 2000. I think that was against the either Titans or the Raiders. I think was it the Titans?
I think so. I mean, I'll go look, but
it was the Raiders. I think it was the Raiders. The Titans would have been a couple. All right, yeah, but Shannon Sharp, to me, one of the greatest tight ends of all time. But the scary thing is, I think it's possible his brother Sterling, who wasn't a tight end, might have been a greater player.
I think Sterling was going to be a greater player. I think he could have been a Hall of Fame guy if he didn't get hurt. He had a neck injury, right? Was that what
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, he was a multi-team All-Pro as well for the receiver for the Green Bay Packers. He was phenomenal early in his career. And you're right, it was against the Oakland Raiders, that 96-yard touchdown reception in 2000. But yeah, Sharp was a phenomenal player. I think people forget when he moved to Baltimore, he wasn't washed up either. When he went to Baltimore, he had 2 800-yard receiving years right there. So this was a guy who was dominant, not even in Denver, but also in Baltimore, even when he switched teams. And usually you see veterans switch teams, they kind of get washed up. But that just wasn't the case with Shannon Sharp.
All right, who do you got at number? Where are you at? 6?
I think we're at 6. My number 6. Let me pull up right. My number 6 is Dave Casper. We already talked about him a little bit, but it's just the icon of having that goes to the post and having that play. So, like you said, there's not always that play for tight ends. Like guys like Shannon Sharp, you can think about various accomplishments and various things he achieved in his career, but you don't necessarily have that one moment of the career where you're like, that's it. And really, for Dave Casper, he has that 4-time first-team All-Pro and 4-time consecutive first-team All-Pro. He was phenomenal. He played on a great team, a great organization at the time. I'm just curious what would have happened if he hadn't ended up in Houston midway through the 1980 season. What if he had stayed with Oakland for more time? I would be curious to see how his career would have ended and if it would have been different.
Yeah, but I don't think it would have, because really, I mean, the Raiders were still good in 80. I mean, but he could have won another Super Bowl in 1983. That's the big thing about it, because he played through 84. But also, I think when you watched him, I mean, there was significant decline by 1981, 1982. So it's possible even he doesn't even make the Raiders team in 83. The Oilers in 83 and the Vikings in 83 were atrocious. The 83 Vikings were one of the worst teams in NFL history. I believe that was the year Les Steckel coached them after Bud Grant had retired. That team was terrible. So, all right, what do you got at number 5?
Yeah, I put him on number 5. I've got Kellen Winslow at 5. I think he's the guy who doesn't have a Super Bowl title, but obviously they were battling with the Chargers back then. They had some chances in the playoffs, but just could never get there. They got eliminated in the second round of the playoffs a couple times, like 2 or 3 times during his career. But he led the league in receptions twice, 3-time consecutive first-team All-Pro, 3 1,000-yard receiving seasons. One of the first guys who was more modernized in the sense of putting up the big yardage year to year.
All right, I'm going to go with number 5, Ozzie Newsome. And I disagree with you a little bit, just because I think he was one of the greatest Browns in history, which they have a great tradition as long as just before 1990. And he made a lot of huge catches in big situations. You look back at like 1979, 1980, when the Browns seemingly every Sunday would have a miraculous comeback. It almost always ended with an Ozzie Newsome play where he goes up, makes a catch, and wins the game for the Browns. 662 catches, 7,980 yards, 47 touchdowns. The Cleveland Browns, when he was there from 78 to 1990, the 79 team barely missed the playoffs. The 80 team loses to Oakland at home on a Brian Sight thrown interception. I think it was red bright something, but they could have tried to kick a field goal. They ended up going for the win with the touchdown. 81, they weren't very good. 1982, they were a playoff team. They lost to the Raiders, I think, in the first round, 27-10 in L.A. I think they were in L.A. then. And then 83, 84 were down years. But then, I mean, after 1970, probably the greatest time to be a Cleveland Browns fan was the mid and late 80s. I mean, 1985, they make the playoffs with an 8-8 record. But they were up, I think, 21-3 on the Miami Dolphins in Miami, but lost the game 24-21. 1986, I think it's debatable. They were the best team in the AFC. They lose at home to Denver on Elway's miraculous last-minute drive. 1987, they lose 38-33 in Denver when you had the Ernest Biner fumble going into the end zone, which would have tied the game and sent it to overtime in the final seconds. And then 1989, they're there again. So, I mean, this is a team that went to 3 straight AFC championship games. He was a huge reason for that. There was never a point where he was the reason they didn't get and win any of those 3 championship games. But this is a Cleveland Brown that made the playoffs 6 times in a decade. When does that ever happen, Sam?
Maybe once. That's it. Maybe with just him and probably nowhere again.
Well, maybe with Otto Graham in the 50s and 60s and those guys. But my number 4 is Kellen Winslow. Now, I got him this low because he was not a great pass-blocking tight end. And to tell you the truth, when I look at this list, I mean, Ozzie Newsome is a guy I would probably take over him. So I'm going off of what I wrote a couple years back on thegrillingtruth.com. But when I think about this, I think Winslow is a guy, he's right there with Newsome. I think Newsome might have been a little bit better a blocker, but he was one of the original deep downfield threats, tight end spot. He was 6'5", 250 pounds. And we talked about iconic moments. Now, outside of the ghost of the post, all the guys on my list, the only other one that can throw up something like that would be that epic playoff game in January of 1982, the 1981 AFC divisional playoff, where the Chargers are up 24-0 on Miami. Miami comes back and takes the lead. Kellen Winslow makes great play after great play in that playoff game against Miami. It's 85 degrees. You get the iconic picture of his 2 teammates basically carrying him off the field. He blocked, I believe, 2 field goals that would have won the game for the Miami Dolphins. So when you look at him and his stats, 541 catches, 6,741 yards, you also got to remember this. Yeah, he was one of the first tight ends that was really used in a passing offense the way he was. So you might wonder why his numbers aren't as good as some of the other guys on here. But you got to remember the San Diego Chargers, Eric Coryell, late 70s up into the mid-80s, had maybe the greatest pass-catching trio of wide receivers in NFL history. You had John Jefferson, Wes Chandler, Charlie Joyner, Kellen Winslow, Chuck Muncie was the running back. So the thing is this, if you put him on a different team that maybe doesn't have 5 elite players or 4 elite players outside of him, the numbers might have been even greater, Sam.
Yeah, you put him on a team where he's the number 1 or 2 option in the receiving game, it's totally different. You might have a guy who gets 1,000 yards 4 or 5 times in his career just because of that. But I do agree. That offense was loaded. That had all the offensive weapons on there they could possibly want. And I think that you're right. That moment where he's getting carried off the field, where he's given everything in that game, is probably what cements him as a legendary figure that will never be forgotten, because he has that game, which was just phenomenal for him and for his team.
Well, how about this, Sam? I believe this. I believe Dan Fouts should be nowhere near the Hall of Fame. I think Dan Fouts not being able to at least getting to a Super Bowl with the amount of talent they had. People forget 1979, maybe the greatest upset in playoff history. The Houston Oilers go to San Diego. The Oilers the week before played the Denver Broncos in one of the most brutal playoff games ever played. They win the game in the Astrodome 10-7. They lost their number one receiver, Ken Burrow. They lost their starting quarterback, Dan Pastorini. They lost Earl Campbell. They didn't have any of those three guys when they went to San Diego, and they beat the Chargers. I think it was 17-14. And the difference in that game was there was a safety by the name of Vernon Perry. Vernon Perry had like 4 interceptions, played maybe the greatest defensive game in a playoff game ever, but he picks off Dan Fouts 4 times while they're winning the Super Bowl with their backup quarterback, their backup running back, and a backup wide receiver. And that was a game that, to me, Dan Fouts should win that game. And in 1979, if Dan Fouts wins that game, I don't remember, but it seems to me that maybe the Chargers were the number 1 seed even that year. And if they were the number 1 seed, Pittsburgh has to go to San Diego. And at the end of the 1979 season, the last game of the season on Monday Night Football in San Diego beat the Pittsburgh Steelers 35-7. So to me, Dan Fouts is the one that failed here when it came to getting the Chargers to the Super Bowl. It wasn't Don Coryell. It wasn't Kellen Winslow. Because offensively, you had a great offensive line too. Guys like Ed White, who was a big part of the Minnesota Vikings going to 3 Super Bowls in the early 70s. So when you look at this, I think guys like, Kellen Winslow, Charlie Joyner, John Jefferson, Wes Chandler, Chuck Muncie, I think it's absolutely atrocious that a guy like Dan Fouts is in the Hall of Fame and a guy like Kenny Anderson didn't. Because also remember this, the next week, 59 degrees below zero, Kenny Anderson threw the ball like he was hanging out at the beach, while Dan Fouts choked like a bitch.
And he had 5, and it wasn't just 4 interceptions that game. He threw 5 in that playoff game. You can't possibly
four to Vernon Perry, I believe.
Yeah, 4 to 1 guy alone. You're making the other guy a lot of money.
The interesting thing about Vernon Perry is, how people talk about the 79 championship game and how Renfro was in and that call cost the Oilers. The thing people forget is this. The only reason the Oilers were even in that game, because the Steelers' defense shut them down, was early in the game. I think Vernon Perry intercepted a pass, ran it back for a touchdown, and actually gave the Oilers a 7-3 lead early. Outside of that, the Oilers' offense did nothing. So Vernon Perry, when you look at his history, even the year before that, in 1977, Perry was 78, I think it was a 77. Perry plays in the Grey Cup up in Canada, the equivalent to our Super Bowl. He intercepted 3 passes in that game. So this is a guy in Vernon Perry who may not have had a legendary Hall of Fame career, but when it came to clutch performers as a defensive back, Vernon Perry was one of the greats of all time.
Yeah, I'm looking at his stats now. He played in 4 playoff games during his time in the NFL. He had 6 interceptions in those games. He did return that 1 for a touchdown. So you can't really ask for much more from a defensive back, but to put that kind of production, that's just incredible in a short span like that.
Yeah, and I think this also. I think that Dan Fouts' failure against that Oilers team should actually put Bum Phillips in the Hall of Fame, because I think what he did in that playoff game, I don't think you could fault the Houston Oilers for losing the 2 championship games to the Pittsburgh Steelers, because the Pittsburgh Steelers were just a better football team. But when you look at Bum Phillips taking a team without their starting quarterback, without their starting running back, who's a Hall of Famer, and their best wide receiver, going into San Diego, playing a Chargers team that I think was 12-4 that year, with all that offensive firepower to hold them to, I think the final score was 17-14 or 21-17, to be able to hold that team down and win that game with Rob Carpenter as your running back. To me, is amazing. And it tells you how great a defensive coach that Bum Phillips was. But where are you at? Number 4? I got a little.
Yeah, I think we're at number 4. And for me, my next 3 are very close. Maybe go in any order, Austin. Number 4, 3, and 2. At number 4, it feels weird having this low down the list, but number 4, I have Mike Ditka, who was kind of the first one, I think we can agree on this, one of the first guys to do what we expected from modern tight ends, to kind of become more of a pass catcher. And to do it at a level that was at the Hall of Fame quality of tight end, really. He had a 1,000-yard season in his rookie year in 61, comes back in 62, and has a 900-yard receiving year, 794 yards, 63, 897, 64. So he was really one of the first hands to crack it open and start going for these larger yardage totals.
Yeah, and Ditka is my number 3, actually. And he was inducted in the Hall of Fame in 1988. That's another one. Why did it take so long? 16 years after. 5-time Pro Bowler, won the Super Bowl with the Dallas Cowboys, Super Bowl 6 towards the end of his career, but did make some plays in that Super Bowl against the Dolphins. And like you said, he had a great rookie season. And really, when he got to the Bears, 61, 62, 63, the Bears were an extremely good football team. I mean, they won an NFL championship in 1963, I believe, by beating the Giants 14-10. But after that, that team kind of fell off the face of the earth. He plays there until 66. He goes to the Eagles, who are another atrocious team in 67 and 68. But I think that when you look at the Dallas Cowboys, he goes to the Cowboys. He's a veteran leader on that team from 1969 to 72. Before 1969, what was the Cowboys' MO? They could get to the playoffs, but they couldn't get over the top. I think Mike Ditka is one of the guys that was a huge contributing factor to them finally getting over the hump and winning the Super Bowl, Sam.
Well, and you have a guy like that on your team, it always helps out. And a veteran presence like him is just something else. And Ditka was still productive. I know in 1970 he didn't have much, but in 1971, 1972, he still put together for about 500 yards, about 47 receptions between those 2 years. So he was still a productive player on those teams. It's not like he totally fell off a cliff and stopped playing.
Well, I think he caught a touchdown in Super Bowl 6, didn't he?
He did.
Okay. My memory was right there. All right. Who do you got at 3? Or was that your 3?
That was my number 4.
All right. So what's your 3?
My number 3, and this is the guy who unretired this offseason, is now back in the NFL. Number 3 is Rob Gronkowski. I think you could flip him with number 2. You could definitely make that argument because of how physical and how dominant he is.
I think you can make the argument for Gronk at number 1.
I think so, too. I think you can honestly do it just based on his – I mean, you look at this guy. He's a great run blocker. I know, even though he's not necessarily the most technical run blocker, but he just knock guys over. I mean, he's so strong.
Well, that Super Bowl 2 years ago, the biggest part of them maybe winning that game was his ability to block downfield.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising the evolution Gronk went through during his time in the NFL because he was a physical guy coming in with some questions, some injury concerns coming into the league. But then if you really look, like around 2014, 2015, I want to say, he became much more known as a run blocker or as a blocker in general during that time. I think he really worked on developing not just as a receiver, because he had traits to do stuff like that. He ended up turning into a good run blocker. I think we'll be interested to see how that plays out in Tampa Bay this year. But I think he's one of the most complete tight ends in league history. He's scored 79 touchdowns, I want to say, like in 7 or 8 years. So, I mean, it's just an incredible production from a guy like him.
All right, Sam. Where am I at? Number 2? Or you're
number 2.
What's your number 2?
My number 2 is John Mack. And this is a guy I said I could flip him with Rob Gronkowski. I could see doing that. But at some point, there's just something about Mackey and those Colts teams. They have so many great players that he played alongside in Unitas and guys like Lenny Moore too, Vernon Perry, 5-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro, a Super Bowl champion, an NFL champion. I mean, this is a guy who, when playing for the Baltimore Colts, didn't have an 1,000-yard season, but he still felt like he was the most dominant tight end in football at points during his career. So I think Mackey is deserving of a top 4 spot at least. I have a number 2, but I think you can make the argument for knocking him down 1 or 2 spots. I
got Mackey at number 2, and I think you can make the argument he could be up a spot. I think he was that dominant at his position. I think the problem is with my number 1's numbers are so huge, it's hard to ignore. But I think he was the first really big play threat who revolutionized the position of tight end. And I think you can make a strong case that he's the best ever, even though he's only got 331 catches, a little over 5,000 yards, 38 TDs. He was a guy that was dominant in all phases of the game. So John Mackey to me at number 2 is fine. And number 1 to me is a no-brainer here. Did we give your number 2 yet?
Yeah, my number 2 was John. My number 2 was John Mackey.
Yeah, number 1, I think we're going to agree on this, is Tony Gonzalez. I mean, 14-time Pro Bowler, over 1,300 catches, over 15,000 yards, 111 TDs. He holds almost every NFL record for tight end. He was the greatest pass-catching tight end ever. And while he wasn't as good a blocker as a John Mackey or a Mike Ditka, he was a solid blocker. I mean, it's not like he was Kellen Winslow. And see, my thing with Kellen Winslow is if we're just going on pass-catching ability, Kellen Winslow is probably top 2. I drop him to 4 because he was not a great blocker. And really, with Kellen Winslow, I mean, I could drop him below Newsome because of the blocking, or Sharp even. But, with Tony Gonzalez, he was a better than average blocker, but he was by far the best receiving tight end of all time.
Yeah, he's told stories about, since he retired, that he didn't necessarily love blocking. He didn't want to go out and block all the time, but he absolutely could do it. And there are times where he's displayed that and showed his dominance in that form of the game as well. But this is a guy who had 4 different 1,000-yard receiving seasons during his career. He played from 1977 through 2013. And even in his final year, in his age 37 season, he had 859 receiving yards for 8 touchdowns. I mean, he was good. He could have played until he was 40 probably. I mean, realistically.
You do realize you said he played from 1977 to 2013.
Oh, did I? Whoops. 1997, yeah. I meant. But, I mean, that would be really impressive if he did do that. But, I mean, he was.
Oh, that would be impressive. He'd be in a wheelchair probably, too.
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's true. But I think this is a guy who could have played into his 40s, honestly. He was that good. It's just a shame he never really had great playoff success. I think he only got past the first round of the playoffs one time during his career. I think that was in 2012 with the Atlanta Falcons. Other than that, never really had any kind of postseason success individually in any kind of games or anything like that. But other than that, I mean, his career statistically, it's just you can't really compete with it if you're another tight end.
All right. I just wanted to bring up real quick, I just found an article that says Antonio Brown doesn't want to retire now.
Well, that was quicker than I even expected. I thought it'd be like at least 2 weeks before we heard something, but
yeah. So I guess Antonio Brown will be back, but he doesn't want to retire. He just wants the NFL to finish the investigation. All right, Sam, you want to tell everybody where they can find you on the internet?
Yeah, you can find me at Sam_Teets33 on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. I'm constantly posting new stats, polls, and articles there every day, so feel free to go check those places out.
All right, you can follow me at Grueling Truth. You can hear all of our shows on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Facebook Live, YouTube Live. But for now, for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.